When you get your commercial pilot's license, the first question your friends will ask you is, so you can get paid to fly now, right? Well, maybe. Being able to get compensated for your work as a pilot is one thing. Being able to operate a commercial flight and charge for it is quite another. A good analogy is the food service industry. I don't have any training as a chef, but I can feed my friends and family all the free meals I want. If I want to get paid for my talents, though, I'll need to get licensed by the health department or at least take a food handler course. Even then, though, I can't just turn my house into a restaurant and start booking dinner service. Restaurants, caterers, and other establishments have to go through so much more licensing and inspection in order to operate commercially. So just like there's a difference between being able to get paid to cook and running a commercial eatery, there's a big difference between getting paid to fly and being able to run a commercial flight operation. These requirements are complicated, as you'd imagine. We'll go through the basics here. We're flight instructors here at Flight Insights, so we'll look at this in the context of doing your commercial pilot training. But any question about a specific operation should be discussed with an attorney. Let's look at what kind of flights we can do commercially and what, if any, certifications we'd need beyond just our pilot's license. The first question is, are we operating this flight for compensation or hire? This seems straightforward. Is someone paying you money for this flight, right? You may remember from private that it's a bit more complicated, though. As private pilots, FAR 61.113 prohibits us from getting compensation for flying. Remember that the FAA considers it compensation even if your passengers pay for some or all of the flight expenses. Even though the money doesn't go in your pocket, and even the IRS doesn't care about taxing it as income, the FAA still says you're being compensated. There's an exception for private pilots in this reg, of course. As long as we're paying at least the pro rata share of the operating expenses, which are specifically listed as fuel, oil, airport expenditures, and rental fees, we're okay to have our passengers chip in a little for the flight. Here's some examples of compensation then. If you and a friend fly to Martha's Vineyard and they pay for your dinner that night, you've been compensated for that flight. Again, even though the money doesn't go in your pocket. If you fly with this friend and they pay for half of the fuel and tie-down fees for the flight, you are receiving compensation still, but since you're paying your pro rata share, you have an exemption to accept this even as a private pilot. Is there anything the FAA doesn't consider compensation? Let's say you and your friend make this flight to Martha's Vineyard and you get nothing but gratitude and fond memories. All right, now you're not being compensated in this case. There are other considerations like whether you can fly with passengers for business as a private pilot, which are listed out in the Section 2, but we'll leave private pilot topics in the past. So if we answer no to this compensation question, or we're paying our pro rata, the flight falls under Part 91 of the FAR. This is the same part we do our flying under when we're just flying by ourselves for fun. In other words, all you need is your private pilot license and a Class 3 medical or basic med. There's no need to get further certifications as an operator. This is just me in my kitchen serving up food for my family. If we are getting compensated for this flight, we need to then ask, are we carrying persons or property from place to place? This is a two-part question, but it's pretty straightforward. Are we carrying passengers or cargo, and are we going from point A to B instead of returning to the same airport? If the answer is no, we may be able to get an exception from getting a certification for this commercial flight. We'll look at 119.1E to find out. Part 119 details the types of air carrier certificates required for most commercial operators. This part doesn't apply to certain operations. If we're conducting one of these operations, we don't need to apply for an air operator certificate and can conduct those flights under Part 91. The reg lists 11 exempted operations. Student instruction is exempt. Most flight instruction can take place under Part 91. Air tours, which begin and end at the same airport and remain within a 25 statute mile radius, can be Part 91 with a letter of authorization, which usually says the pilots have to submit to regular drug testing. Some other operations like banner tow, ferry flights, skydiving flights are also exempted. So if our flight falls into one of those 11 categories in 119.1E, we don't need to get certified and can operate commercially under Part 91. If we don't fall into that category or we're carrying persons or property from place to place, we need to then ask, are we holding out a willingness to do so? When you hold yourself out to the general public at large for services, you're commonly regarded as a commercial carrier. The FAA seeks to clarify what holding out is in Advisory Circular 120-12A. Signs and advertising are the most direct means of holding out, but are not the only ones. So a classic example of holding out here would be taking out a radio ad promoting flights for hire, since the general public is being targeted on the whole for any and all flights. But if you post a sticky note on the bulletin board at your small FBO saying you're flying to a specific airport in New Hampshire at a specific date and time, if anyone wants to tag along and pay you, this may not be holding out, as it's targeting a limited and defined audience. The advisory circular also mentions holding out may be done through agents who identify customers and connect them with you. So an example would be a travel agency or a website which often books travel for passengers on airlines, then connects a customer to you for a flight. This could be an example of holding out. Another example of holding out would be if you have a reputation of serving all who want to pay for a flight. An example here would be a pilot who flies round trip to Atlanta every Friday and is known amongst more than just their closest inner circle as the guy to ask for a ride to Atlanta. This might be an example of holding out. Finally, the number and the nature of the contracts would be a clue as to whether the pilot was holding out. The circular says that a carrier with 18 to 24 contracts was determined to have been holding itself out to serve, while a carrier with just 3 contracts might not have been. There's no exact number triggering holding out versus not holding out, but it's an indication of your willingness to serve all. These questions so far, whether you're holding out a willingness to carry persons or property from place to place for compensation or hire, determine whether you're involved in what's called common carriage or not. Common carriage is a legal term that's interpreted by the courts, not defined by the FAA like so many of the other regs we learn about. This is why that advisory circular is a good guide for what is common versus private carriage, but specific instances may only be able to be settled in court. In any case, if we determine the answer to all these questions is yes, and we are in fact a common carrier, our next question deals with whether we have operational control over the flight. This term is one that gets a nice definition from the FAA. Operational control with respect to flight means the exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. In other words, you may be the pilot, but who's really calling the shots? Whether or not we have operational control comes down to the arrangements that were made. If you provide the aircraft and the flight crew, you're providing what's called a wet lease. You're in operational control of this flight. If, however, the client provides the aircraft and you're just the pilot, this is called a dry lease. The client has operational control. In determining operational control, the FAA will look really hard at the arrangement to make sure a dry lease really is a dry lease and not a wet lease with a cute contract. You can provide the aircraft and the crew and still have the client retain operational control in some special arrangements spelled out in 91.501. These list 3 arrangements: time-sharing, interchange, and joint ownership, where operational control rests with the client. Part 91 subpart K also lists fractional ownership operations as falling into this category. It makes sense if you think about it. In such an arrangement, the passenger is a part owner and so has some control over the flight. Here's some examples. You rent an aircraft and charge someone to fly them to their summer home. You have operational control. Now, if this person rents an aircraft and hires you to fly them to their summer home, they have operational control. If you work for NetJets, a fractional ownership operator, you do not have operational control. So in answering this question, sometimes thought of as a wet versus dry lease question, if the answer is yes, we'll then ask if this is a scheduled flight service. Do we publish a regular schedule of flights to the public? If the answer is yes, we're really starting to sound like an airline here, which operates under Part 121 or 129 for some foreign operations. These certifications are understandably the most stringent and costly to obtain and keep. If we don't have regularly scheduled flights, we operate under Part 135 as a commuter or on-demand service. The requirements for this certification are considerable as well, though not as much so as those for the airlines. If we go back to that holding out question and determine that no, we're not holding out, and so we're not a common carrier, we'll then look at the size of our aircraft to see what our certification requirements are. If we're in private carriage with a smaller aircraft, one that's both fewer than 20 passenger seats and less than 6,000 pounds, we'll certify as a Part 135 commuter or on-demand carrier. If we're flying a big aircraft for private carriage, though, we'll need a Part 125 certificate. If we decide we're on a dry lease or otherwise don't have operational control of a common carriage flight, we're probably okay to fly under Part 91, but need to first see about our own restrictions. Are we, as a pilot, IFR rated? If yes, there's no restrictions. You can operate commercially under Part 91. If we don't have that instrument rating, though, we're restricted from carrying passengers on flights over 50 nautical miles or at night. So if the flight calls for either of those things, We can only get paid if we're hauling checks or some other non-human cargo. All of these operations down here, whether under Part 91 or with an operator certificate, whether common or private carriage, require us to have our commercial pilot certificate, as well as a Class 1 or 2 medical, depending on the situation. The lone example here would be if you're an instructor teaching students. Whether or not you can fly for hire in different circumstances is one of the first things you learn about when going for the commercial license. It's also one of the more confusing topics thanks to concepts like common carriage and holding out. Just remember that the FAA's interest is in protecting the general public, and the more you target the public at large with your service as a commercial pilot, the more you'll need to comply with safety and inspection regulations.